Hosted by Mary Howden, this week's special guest is Ash Regan, an independent member of the Scottish Parliament. Ash's Prostitution Bill seeks to criminalise the purchase of sex and provides support to help women exit prostitution. Ash describes prostitution as a system of commercial sexual exploitation that targets the vulnerable. She takes us through the excruciatingly slow process of attempting to get her bill considered, likening it to trying to push treacle uphill. We also hear how Ash spectacularly resigned in order to vote against the Gender Recognition Reform Bill.
Welcome to Ash Regan, who is one of our MSPs here in the Scottish Parliament. Ash is a real woman of integrity, really, and there are very few politicians in Scotland that are actually have that integrity, and that she resigned over the introduction of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. And she, I think we were really pleased here in Scotland that Ash actually took that stand, because it didn't look like anyone else was going to take a stand in relation to it. And so it's really nice to be able to talk to you today. But actually, what we're here to focus on really is that you have been your introduction of the Unbuyable Bill, which is in process at the moment. So I wanted to talk to you a bit more about that, and also to think about, where does that link in with what may or may not be happening within the Westminster Parliament in relation to women and prostitution. So welcome. It's nice to see you here. So thank you for joining us. My first question is really, what was it that got you into politics?
Well, I did do a politics degree, so I've always been interested in politics, and I remember I'm quite interested in it. And I remember exactly where I was the moment I heard that Margaret Thatcher had resigned. So I think for a 16, 17-year-old, that was probably quite unusual at the time. But I didn't know how to get into politics. I didn't really know anyone who was in politics. So I didn't progress it at that point. So I kind of parked it, went off and did other things. And then the independence referendum kind of came up, and I was talking to my then husband about it, and he was saying, you're interested in politics, you really should get involved in this. This is going to be the biggest thing happening in Scotland for a generation, or whatever, how we want to phrase it. And I'd never been active in politics up until that point, and I thought, yeah, maybe I should. So I turned up to the inaugural. Well, the funny thing was, I think he thought I was going to be campaigning on the no side, and then I went and joined the yes campaign. So that was quite funny. But I turned up to the inaugural meeting of Yes Gala Shields, and it was just me and three guys in a room above a pub, and then it sort of started there, and that's how I got involved in active politics, and then decided at that point that that was something that I wanted to pursue. And then the hardest part of it, I think, was actually getting selected inside a political party, and I've heard that from other people as well, that it can be quite hard to get selected as your party's candidate to go forward. Then once I did get selected, and I think I got selected my fourth try, and I was almost about to give up because I just kept losing. And then I thought, well, maybe this is not for me. But then I was successful and it was actually an all-women shortlist. And that was the first time that I'd taken part in an all-women shortlist for Edinburgh Eastern. And I was successful in that one. And then obviously that was the seat the SNP already held. So there was a good chance that, that if I didn't do anything silly, I would go on to hold that seat for the SNP, which I did.
Okay. And you've had quite a meteoric rise, really, in terms of roles that you've had in the Parliament, and especially with the SNP, and that you were appointed as a minister seems like it was quite quickly, really.
Yeah, it was. It was 2 years. So I personally think there was quite a good intake in that session in 2016 with the women shortlist. There were some good men as well, but there's some good women that came in through that process. People like, Kate Forbes and, lots of people that have gone on to serve in the cabinet, like Mary Howden and who else? Jenny Go-Ruth was in that intake. So there was quite a number of people that have gone on to hold high office in that group. So yeah, but it's not the fastest. There are people that have gone in who were obviously known to leadership that got elected and were put straight into the cabinet or as ministers. So I think Mary McCallan has never been a backbencher, so she was in the 2021 intake, and she's gone straight in. So I think the numbers here are not as many. You know, obviously, if you've got about 60 people in the government backbench, and you've got more than, I don't know how many people are in government now, I think it could be something like 26, then it's not an enormous pool of people to draw from to get your ministers from. So it seems like most of the people in the backbenches have had some kind of a time in government. But yeah, I enjoyed my time in government, and I certainly felt it was something to, you know, it is a privilege to be given a portfolio like that. And certainly like community safety, where there's an opportunity to make decisions that really will either benefit or cause issues for people in the country. So I took it very seriously and made sure, you know, tried to look into things as much as possible. But I think ultimately what I learned through that is that sometimes it's very hard to change the system. Even though you might see that there's a problem, and everybody might agree with you that there's a problem, it can be very hard to sort of like turn that Titanic around to get things moving in a different direction. And that was something I learned from that, is that how difficult it is, and how sometimes the system is working in such a way that it can be almost impossible to get change.
And I suppose with you saying that, am I right in thinking that when you were in that position, that was your first attempt at trying to address prostitution and changing the whole kind of dynamics and understanding of it? But it wasn't.
Yeah, I was actually just on the brink of doing prostitution as a members' bill in 2018, and I was just about to launch it. Around about the same time. I think I was planning on launching it something like June, and then I got promoted just before that in the May. And so obviously you can't pursue a members' bill once you get put into government. I did ask around to see if there were any other backbenchers that hadn't been promoted at that time that would like to take it forward on my behalf, but nobody else wanted to do it. And I thought, well, you know, it's not too bad because prostitution is actually in the ministerial portfolio that I've been given. So I thought, oh, this is great. You know, it felt like everything was aligning. And I thought I'll be able to pursue it in government, which I did do. But the way it works in government is that because they, you know, quite often they change the ministers out quite a lot, not as much as at Westminster, where I once read that they change the junior ministers in Westminster every 11 months. So you can imagine, I would say it takes a good few months to get up to speed with your portfolio, then another few months to kind of set a direction, try to change the direction, and then achieve things. So sometimes I joke that that's why the country's in the state that it's in, because you can't achieve anything as a minister, you know, after like 11 months in post. I think Scotland's better because they leave people in post much longer. And I was in that particular job for just, I think it was about 4.5 years, and it probably would have been longer had I obviously not taken the decision to suddenly resign from the job. But most of it is things that people have already agreed to on your behalf. So perhaps the cabinet secretary's agreed to something, or the first minister's agreed to something, or this has been a long-standing commitment the government have made. So you arrive, you've got this big pile of things on your desk that you've had no say in, that's already been agreed, and in some cases are already partly moving. You know, they're already halfway through or 3/4 of the way through. So that's quite an adjustment to just pick up work that's already going. So somebody gave me advice right at the beginning. And said to me, you know, you need to find a way to find things in your portfolio that you're really interested in, that you feel you can make a difference on. And so my constituency is very blighted by fireworks disorder. It'll be starting up again shortly. And so I decided that the two things that I was going to do that I hadn't inherited, you know, that weren't on my desk, was fireworks law reform and prostitution law reform. And I would say that I pursued them both with the same amount of vigour. And I obviously got the fireworks law through, although the government has not implemented large parts of that piece of legislation, but that's a matter for another podcast, probably. I didn't manage to get the prostitution bill through. Although when I left government, it certainly was on the legislative planner. So obviously government plan what they're going to do, and they had it varied, but it would appear in year 3, and sometimes it was in year 5. So perhaps if I'd have stayed, we would be doing this bill anyway, but maybe I'd be doing it as the government minister rather than doing it as a members' bill.
Right. Did I read correctly that the Butte House agreement might have had some impact on that? And so for those of you that aren't familiar with that, that's the relationship between the SNP and the Greens party about a common agenda in terms of taking things forward. And they've got a very different view, haven't they, on prostitution?
They have. So obviously political parties obviously have a manifestos and that they'll, take positions, or they can change on certain policies. And some of them will be well known. Other ones you have to dig around to find out what this a particular party will think about certain things. So in the Scottish Parliament, I would say it looks pretty much like the Conservatives, the SNP and Labour Party have made statements that look like they're broadly in line with what I'm suggesting. And the Liberal Democrats and the Greens are very much opposed. So they have party policy that says that they are, in my view, would be they're pro-exploitation. They probably don't explain it like that, but that's, in my view, that's where they are. And so when the Greens came into government, when we had this Butte House agreement, the way they did it was they had areas of agreement, and then that would be, they'd be working very closely together and supporting each other on. And then obviously, because two different political parties, they didn't agree on everything, they had areas that were outside the agreement. And when I first saw, because I was obviously in government, I could see the iterations of that document. And when I first saw it, and I could see that prostitution was outside, and my heart sank, because I just thought, I'm not going to get this through now, because it's going to be considered to be something that the government don't want to work on, because they don't want to upset their partners in government. And you never really find out in government, or I never found out, what the blockers are to certain things. You just feel the resistance. So you ask for things and it takes 3 times longer than it does in something else. You set a direction with something, and then the civil service will come back to you and say they didn't quite understand. 3 months later, they didn't quite understand what you'd asked them, and surely it was this you'd asked for. And you're like, no. So you just feel this general sense of trying to, push treacle uphill, which you don't get with everything else. So I never really got to the bottom of why, but I suspected it was some combination of, either somebody in the civil service or high up in government didn't want to do it, or it was something to do with the Butte House agreement, but I never quite did get to the bottom of it.
Okay. So you leave the SNP and you go to join ALBA. And is it at that point that you decide that you're going to take the private members bill for your unviable bill? And I presume you had quite a lot of research and stuff that you'd done already in relation to it. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I've actually been working on this for, I think, around about 12 years now, because Rhoda Grant, who's obviously a Labour MSP, had tried to do a very similar piece of legislation in, I think it was 2013, and I wasn't elected at the time, and I actually volunteered with her team to work on trying to help her get that bill through at that time. And she has gone public about that. She's talking about that I'd done that as well. So I was supporting her, and now she's supporting me, which is nice, because it's that cross-party consensus on this, which is a good thing. So I've been working on it for a very long time. I was obviously trying to develop a members bill before I went into government, then went into government, and I was working on it there. So although I didn't succeed in getting the legislation through, I certainly had lots of meetings with organisations. I met with lots of women who had been trafficked, or they had come out of prostitution. I met with some women who were still currently in prostitution. So it enabled me to kind of broaden my knowledge, certainly on the topic, and continue working on it. And before I went to the ALBA party, I actually started working on it again in the SNP. So I had to leave it a little bit. So I was advised by colleagues that they were rather sick of me, and that I shouldn't immediately go back to the group and ask for permission to do a members bill, which I was going to do. Pretty much the minute I resigned, within a few weeks, I was like, right, let's get on with something. And I was told not to go back to the group, because in order to do a members bill, you need the permission of your group to do it. So I waited a few months and then went back and then got permission of the group, although there was a bit of a lively debate about it, and started to progress it then, and then just took it with me when I went to ALBA, basically. So I have almost been working on it continuously through. It seems very last minute. I know everyone is panicking about the timetable, because it is very tight now. But the reality is I have been working on this for a very long time, and it just takes a long time to do legislation. And particularly as the Scottish Parliament has a fairly limited capacity to support members to do members' bills. And I went to see them around about the middle of this session, so about 2.5 years in, to ask for support, to be told that the capacity was already allocated elsewhere and they couldn't help me. And I think at that point they probably thought I would give up and just leave it. But I decided that we would just progress it ourselves. And so the Parliament does fund it, though. So they have given me, well, it's part of my normal budget, I guess. At the moment, I am requesting additional funding from the presiding officer, and I'll see if I get that. But at the moment, so in order to pay for drafting and things like that, it's come out of my budget to do that, because obviously I don't have the expertise in my small parliamentary team to do tasks like that.
Mm-hmm. Although you have, I mean, I remember being at your one of the launch things that you did at the Parliament, and how impressive it was, the amount of work that had gone into it, and just some of the survivors of prostitution stories that you heard there as well was just it's kind of heartbreaking, really, in lots of ways. And I was
Yeah.
wondering if there was anything in particular that's made you take the position that you have in relation to, which I totally agree with, by the way, just in case, you
Yeah.
know.
I don't know. I'm just somebody that, and it's come out through my work as a parliamentarian, that I'm just very concerned about violence against women, about women being treated well in society and be given all the opportunities and protection that men just expect and get in society. And for me, when I first learned about and I can't remember the moment when I first kind of learned about things like sex trafficking and prostitution law, but we're probably going back a while. And for me, I can't think of a clearer example of the patriarchy in action than criminalizing women and girls for their own exploitation and allowing abusers to just walk free with no consequences. And so to me, if you're serious about violence against women and girls, this is not like a niche thing that you might do when you get around to it in time. To me, this is a key current threat to women and girls, and we need to deal with it. We need to change the law, and it's way overdue that we do that.
I would agree. It's quite interesting. I was at Philia a couple of weeks ago, and the activists who were there, kind of shouting things, were shouting, and it was a man, very obviously a man. He wasn't even making any effort to dress up as a woman, was shouting out sex workers' work. And you think you don't even really see the irony there in terms of what you're actually doing, you know. So. So yeah, so but as well as that, there has been some criticism of obviously of what you're doing, and there have been stories in the press about it's the wrong approach that you're taking, and you're going to make it harder for women who are in prostitution. They're going to be subjected to more violence, etc., etc. What have you said to people about that?
Well, I think the first thing that we've all got to accept is that this is a multi-billion pound or billion pound industry where the commodity is women and girls' bodies, and it's
Mhm.
extremely lucrative. So if you're a trafficker or a pimp, you can make hundreds of thousands of pounds just off one single victim a year. So you can imagine there's a huge investment of um, wanting to maintain this and make it as easy as possible for pimps, traffickers, and buyers, because obviously they create the market, to continue this system to make sure that they're all lining their pockets. But obviously, this is at the expense of women and girls. And I mean, I can talk a little bit more about what the reality of prostitution is like, because I think sometimes we are very much fed this glamorized impression of what this industry is like for obvious reasons. So, in every country that has tried to do the Nordic model or the equality model, which is what I'm suggesting, it's the same arguments that come up every single time. And you mentioned that phrase, sex work is work. So that was coined back in the 70s in America, and this attempt to rebrand what we would call sexual or commercial sexual exploitation, and to make it, to sanitize it, to remove the reality of what it was, and to I think to extent to try to normalize it within society because of the profits involved in it. So it's no surprise to me that I'm being attacked in the press, and indeed, I'm imagining it will increasingly get more and more personal, because as the other side starts to lose the argument, and as it's very clear that most of the facts and so-called statistics that the other side put forward are very far from that. They usually come from sources that aren't very credible or very small studies where they haven't been peer reviewed, etc. And when you look into their claims, they just fall apart like a house of cards. There's nothing to back up the claims that they're making. But they are a powerful lobby, and they do get media coverage. People do listen to what they're saying, but it's up to me and the people that are supporting me to try to push back on this and to make sure that the parliamentarians that are looking at this and will eventually vote on this at stage one, which we now know is going to be in January, have got the facts and the evidence in front of them, and they're very clear about what is the right way to deal with this. And that's what the international evidence says. So the international evidence, and it is piling up, says that if you go to a regime, and there are different words for it and different names for it, but essentially you can either have a regime where you try to reduce the demand, which is that you criminalise the buyer. And that's what the Nordic model or the equality model does. And it can have other bits around it. Or you have a model where you decriminalise everything. So you decriminalise pimps, you decriminalise trafficking. And in every jurisdiction that has gone down that road, so the obvious ones that people will know about would be places like the Netherlands and Germany, which is now called the Bordello of Europe, and other places like New Zealand. In every country that's gone down that road, the trafficking has increased, the violence against women has increased, prices have been reduced, and organised crime has basically moved in and taken over this sector. So the problem is, I mean, I'm not suggesting Scotland wants to go down that road, but the countries that have gone down that road, it's very difficult to then reverse that and go the way we're going. So I think it's better to do the Nordic model, and the evidence there is that the Nordic model reduces trafficking, it reduces the market of prostitution, so it does reduce harm if you want to look at it that way, but just because less people are going into prostitution to be harmed, and it offers decriminalisation to people that have been involved in the sex trade, and then support for them as well. So specialist support for them, including support to exit if that's what they want.
Is there enough support as it is for women in prostitution?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's very difficult. We don't have very good data, but we think, and this is based on UK information that we've kind of extrapolated to Scotland, that there could be between 6,000 and 8,000 people being exploited in the sex trade in Scotland. Now, those numbers are huge. And we actually only have one dedicated organisation that supports women who want to exit, and that's called Roots Out, and it's in Glasgow. And it's never received any government funding. It is funded by the City Council. So no, I think anybody that you speak to that works in frontline services would say to you that this is a very underfunded area, which it really needs looking at. And I would say that the government makes a lot of statements, it makes a lot of platitudes about how, it's leading on violence against women and so on. I believe that when you look at where the money is going, that it doesn't follow, it isn't backed up by what's happening on the ground.
Well, even in other aspects of violence against women and girls, if you even look at domestic abuse figures, it's at the highest it's been since the 1970s, which is actually quite shocking, really, when you think about it. And I suppose the other bit around, the correlation between the figures for, 16 to 34-year-olds who are experiencing domestic abuse are also the ones who are experiencing non-fatal strangulation. And it's that group that are, and you just think, what is it that we're doing for our young women and girls in Scotland? It's terrible. I see that I noticed that Police Scotland were supportive of your bill, which can you tell us how that came about?
Well, I mean, it is obviously the equally safe strategy for the Scottish Government, and the violence against women part of it is also supported by COSLA. So many organisations that are linked to the Scottish Government do subscribe to the policy that prostitution is violence against women. So I think if you're coming from that starting point, then it seems quite obvious that this is the policy choice that you would make. So so Police Scotland have, they responded. So there's a number of different parts of consultation that have to be carried out with bills, all types of bills, even members' bills. So I ran a consultation over the summer last year, and I think I ran that it was over you have to do 12 weeks, but I think I ran that over 12 weeks because it was over the summer, and I wanted to make sure everyone had enough time to respond. So I got about 100 really good quality submissions to that, including Police Scotland and lots of other organisations. And then the committee, when they start to, so it's gone to the Criminal Justice Committee in the Scottish Parliament. They're the committee that's going to, look at the evidence for the law change. They then do what they call a call for evidence, and they've had submissions. I think they had around 500 submissions. I think they had a number more of individuals responding. And again, so we've had responses from COSLA, the police, lots of frontline services, lots of individuals, some international organisations have responded. So it's quite an interesting mix. So we went through those responses, the ones to the committee. One of my team just kind of went through and had a quick skim through them. And we estimate that about 62% of those responses are in favour of this law change. So that's very positive. And what we've seen is that all the frontline services that work with women in this area are obviously all supporting the policy. And a lot of organisations in Scotland, like organisations like COSLA, like the police, are supporting it. But we've had a response from some individuals, and certainly in the consultation that we ran, a lot of those individuals were male, who were obviously saying they didn't support it and then putting their reasons down. So, obviously, like any policy, there are people that agree with it and people that don't. And this is part of the process, is that you take evidence from people that might have special expertise in the area or expertise in things like implementation, like the court service. We want to make sure that if this is passed into law, that it's not just window dressing, it's actual law that is usable, it can be enforced properly, and it really has a desired effect. So I'm continuing to meet with as many people as possible, and I was meeting with the sentencing council today, to make sure that we thought we'd got the sentence, the level of proposed sentencing right. And then I was meeting with SACRO, so they get quite a lot of government funding to work with women who are exploited in prostitution. So I'm just kind of continuing that, and I'm open to listen to anybody if anyone's got ideas about how we improve it, because we'll obviously if it passes at stage 1, we then go on to stage 2, which is all the amendments. So there may be things that should be in the bill that have been missed out that we can look at. There may be things that the Parliament decides that perhaps they don't want to go as far as I have on certain things. And I think the obvious one on that is that I'm suggesting that people, and it is mainly women, who have been exploited in prostitution and have received convictions for prostitution, so that's called a Section 46 offence in Scotland, would have that expunged or quashed from their records, so it wouldn't be disclosable at any time at all. And the reason for that is that a lot of survivors came to me and said that having a conviction for this that was disclosable made their lives very difficult when they were trying to rebuild their lives and they were trying to move on in their lives. It made things very difficult for them. So I've gone for the highest level of removal, but I'm getting quite a lot of pushback from the government, and I may get pushback from the committee or Parliament if they decide that actually they don't think that's appropriate and we should be looking at maybe we shouldn't be doing it at all, or we should be looking at a slightly more, I don't know how to phrase this, more of a middle ground area rather than going for the high level. You go for a medium level of that. So we'll see. These are the debates that are still to come. If I get it through stage 1, I need a simple majority of parliamentarians at stage 1.
And how's that going? Do you have...
Yeah, so I'm in my parliamentary office at the moment, and I really shouldn't have this on here because I keep getting opposition politicians in, and I can see they're staring at my board. So I've got a board over here where I've got the numbers that I think I've got so far. So I won't say exactly what I think that is, but my politician's response to that is that I'm approaching getting a majority.
Of course you are. What happens, because obviously we've got an election next year, so what happens in terms of timescales after stage 1? Let's assume you get it through. Let's think positively.
So the timing's very tight. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. It's very, very tight. But interestingly, there's a number of bills behind me in the queue. So I've spoken to a number of other members that also have members' bills that are even further behind mine. And everybody's been assured that there is enough time to get them through. The Parliament shuts down for what it calls dissolution. So it's the end of the session. Parliament dissolves in order to prepare for the campaign time and to start a new Parliament in May. And so usually we have about a 6 weeks short campaign period. What the Parliament have done, and they've just voted on this, is we usually have a 1 week off, like a half term type thing in February. That's been cancelled for next year to give the Parliament as much time as possible to finish up this type of legislation. So technically there is enough time, but yeah, it's going to be very tight. And I imagine that if it does pass at stage 1, I will be doing this right up to probably March, to finish it off. So it's going to keep me busy probably right up until the end of this session.
Okay, well, I'm going to hand over to Vicky now, who's going to ask some of the questions from our members, and then I'll come back to you and we'll finish off. So Vicky, back over to you.
Yep, I've got lots of questions. So the first one is, why did you see what others failed to see with the introduction of the GRA? What piqued you on the gender issue?
That's a very good question. So I think, again, I'd been watching this for a long time. So it wasn't the case that I suddenly in what we're saying, sorry, result ended in October 2022. So it wasn't the case that, say, in June or September, I suddenly went, oh, something's happening here, and we need to do something. You might remember that I was one of the members of the SNP who signed an open letter that ended up on the front page of one of the Scottish newspapers, can't remember which one now, urgent caution as far back as 2019. So I had, severe reservations about this policy, and I continued to research it, reading articles. I read every book that I could get my hands on. There's some very good books on this issue, obviously, that I read through. And I have to say that I don't think many of my colleagues did that. So I think there was a few people in the SNP that probably did that. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I bet that there wasn't a single other Scottish Government minister that read a book on this topic to become more informed about it. And I think that was a problem, that in general, the reason that we ended up in this mess is that the government were only listening to one side of the argument. They weren't listening to other voices, and they weren't interrogating this proposed policy to make sure that it worked. They were dismissing, a bit like the way we saw Nicola Sturgeon dismissing criticism in the public sphere. They were doing the same behind closed doors as well. So they just weren't getting it. And the other thing is that I would say, because obviously I spoke to a lot of my colleagues in the SNP at the time about this. I spoke to the whips, I spoke to the parliamentary business manager, I went and had meetings with the cabinet secretary, who was in charge of the bill the first time around, so that was Shirley-Anne Somerville. Who else would I talk to? I spoke to colleagues. I mean, it was no secret what my views were, and I'd had conversations with lots of people across the piece. What I hadn't done is I hadn't directly had a conversation with Nicola, that is true, because Nicola didn't really work like that. You didn't really have conversations with her in that way. But what I had done is, and this is if people haven't read the book, The Women Who Wouldn't Weesht, I would recommend it, because I think it's a good read, and it gives you an idea of exactly what was going on. And I just found out that at some point during the last week or so, that book was higher than Nicola's autobiography. So it's actually higher up the list. But anyway, sorry, I couldn't resist that. So I'd had a meeting with her I guess you would call them the most chief of staff, really, I suppose is the best way to describe it. So the most senior special advisor, who'd come to me 6 months before and said, we know you've got an issue with this. Can we have a chat about it? Nicola wants to know what you're thinking. And I was already prepared for that meeting. I had all my notes ready, because I knew that the day would come when they would waltz into my office and ask me. So it was a very long meeting. I had a 40-minute meeting with this most senior special advisor, where I laid out all the problems with the legislation and said to them that, that I would not be able to vote for it unless all these questions could be answered to my satisfaction. And knowing that they couldn't really do that, because I knew they couldn't answer these questions, because these were the flaws that was inherent in the bill. And it was very clear to me at that meeting that this special advisor knew absolutely nothing about the law in this area. I mean, that's the facts. So anyway, so he then says to me, okay, well, don't do anything, and I'll speak to Nicola and we'll come back to you, basically, because I was saying I can't vote for this. But that's an important distinction, because when you're in government, you can't vote against anything, but you can not vote. So the options are, you could not be there, and that's happened. People will have seen that. There was other pieces of legislation. I think a good example would be Hamza Yousaf not voting on equal marriage. So they just make arrangements for people that have a real problem with something. You're just not there and you don't vote on that day. And that's normal practice, right? So that's one option. Or, if you want to vote against it, you have to resign and vote against it. So I didn't know what would happen at that point. And I actually went to Holyrood magazine. I went to Mandy Rhodes, who I knew had similar views to me on this, and told her about that conversation, because I thought I was so paranoid about this. I thought they might actually try and sack me as a minister now to stop me doing anything about this in the future, and just try and get rid of me. So I thought I better, as a bit of an insurance policy, better tell the media what's happening, so that if they do go on to sack me in the next month or so, that somebody would know the truth about what was going on. Anyway, they didn't do anything, and I think they actually what I'm trying to say here. I think they didn't really think, I don't think they thought I was that serious. And now, when I think back on it now, I think there must be ministers, and cabinet ministers even, who throw their toys out of the pram on a regular basis and say, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to resign. But then they don't resign. So I think they thought this was one of those things, and that I was just saying it and I wouldn't actually do it. So I didn't see this special advisor again until 2 days before the stage 1 vote. So he waltzes back into my office and he goes, right, what's happening? Da, 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 da. And I said, well, you've not answered any of my questions. You've not come back to me. I said, it still stands. We've got 3 options here, which is I resign and I vote against you, or I don't vote. I can't remember what I was suggesting as the third one was, or wasn't there or something like that. And he's just suddenly was like, "You'll resign?" And I was like, "Well, yes." I said it's one of the options, you know. So he was like, "Don't do anything, don't do anything. I'll speak to Nicola." So I then have text messages, which I did give to the newspapers afterwards, because the government were obviously trying to put this line out straight away that I'd never mentioned it, I'd never talked to anybody. So I had a whole list of text messages that I was then able to hand over to the Times to substantiate my side of the story, that obviously we had discussed this. And what he said to me later on was, you know, "Nicola's aware, we'll come back to you, you know, the First Minister's thinking about blah, blah, blah." Anyway, nothing again for 2 days. So I'm just waiting, and I'm at this event because I was obviously the minister that was in charge of the fire service, and it was near fireworks season. And I was at a school in my constituency with fire engines and police and the STV with cameras and everything, waiting to do pieces for the media about fireworks and like antisocial behaviour. And then I got this text message from this special advisor saying, "Turn up and vote." And that's the point where I thought, well, I'm not going to turn up and I'm not going to vote. So I didn't. So I just went home, because what happens is once you've left government, it's pretty brutal. They will literally lock you out of your office and make you carry boxes across the garden lobby in front of everyone, the media. They did it to the Greens as well, to be fair. Much as there's no love lost between me and the Greens, I still thought that was pretty bad when I witnessed it myself. You know, Patrick Harvey trotting through the garden lobby with his cardboard boxes and all that. It's pretty brutal. So I thought, I'm not going in for that. I knew that there would be an intense media interest in this as well. And I thought I wanted some time to think about what I was going to say to the media and all the rest of it. So, because at that point, I hadn't really publicly said very much about it, because anybody that was watching this at the time will know that anybody that did say anything publicly about it in the preceding few years was just cancelled, and it was swift and it was brutal. And so obviously I tried to think, right, well, what am I going to say, which media am I going to talk to, and etc. So I kind of went home for the weekend, just watched it all on the front pages of the papers, which is quite a surreal experience. And then I thought, right, well, the media do have a tendency to chase you around in here. So if you come back into work and you haven't given them what they want, they will chase you around the building. It's quite extraordinary, actually. And so I thought, right, I'll just call a press conference. So that's what I did. And the SNP didn't expect that. I genuinely think they were quite gobsmacked that I'd had the temerity to call a press conference and line up, you know. So I went out, and there was the whole, you've seen it, you know, when they crowd around the First Minister or the leader of the opposition, you know, it's 40 media, like loads of cameras and lights and everything. So it's quite daunting. I hadn't done anything like that before. I went out and, you know, gave a statement, and I said I wouldn't really answer any questions, because I didn't want to be put in a position where I had to then answer loads of questions about all the details of the law, when I didn't feel that I was that confident on it at that point. I became more confident on it, but I think you have to take that time. And yeah, so that's when it started. But there was quite a backlash in here. So what people probably don't realise is that those of us, because it wasn't just me, obviously I was the minister, but there was nine SNP rebels that also didn't vote for that bill. And pretty much we were all ostracised from that point forward. So hardly anybody in the group spoke to us. We were put under quite a lot of pressure to do, you know. And so if you look at now the people those 9 names, and you look at who's standing again for the SNP, I think it's like one person that's coming back, and it's a very experienced person who's been in for a very long time. So, you know, when people say to you, "Oh, why don't more politicians, you know, or why don't more ministers resign, or why don't more politicians vote against the whip?" That's why, because political parties make it incredibly difficult. And when you go against your party in this way, it virtually will end your career. In most cases, it will be career ending doing this type of thing. And people know that. You know, I knew that when I stood up against Nicola Sturgeon and did this and did it publicly, and then, you know, when they tried to spin that I'd done this, that, and the other, I went out and corrected everything, rather than just sitting quietly and let them smear me. I knew that was going to be, you know, career ending. You know that. So that's why more people don't do it, because people have mortgages and they have children and they want to keep their jobs. So yeah, and I get it. I'm not criticizing everybody. It's a very hard thing to do, and most people just don't want to do it.
Yeah, very brave thing to do, Ash. There's a couple of questions about Nicola Sturgeon. What was Nicola's main motivation for backing gender ideology? What was she looking to gain? And the second question about Nicola is, have you read her book?
I haven't read the book, and I won't be reading it. I've thought about this a lot, because I get, you know, a lot of people ask me this, not necessarily in public, but a lot of people ask me privately, you know, because they always assume that I know Nicola really well and I must know what she was thinking, all that. And the truth of the matter is, I don't know Nicola very well. And people were often surprised by me saying that when I'd been a minister for years, that I didn't know Nicola Sturgeon very well, because she really just worked with this sort of immediate circle around her. And so if you weren't in that sort of favoured group of people, which I think was really quite small, you didn't get any time with her and you didn't get to know her in any way. So I didn't know her. So I can only speculate. So I think what happened was that obviously Scotland likes to be leading the way on certain things. It can, considers itself, I think, to be quite progressive in a number of areas. And I think this was sold to her by lobby groups as being something that was going to be pretty much free. So I think that was highly attractive because there wasn't a big price tag attached to this. It would be something that she could then go out into the global stage and say, look what Scotland's done. We're ahead of everybody else. This is the new frontier for human rights and Scotland's leading the way on it. And I think it appealed to her in that way as being a kind of a legacy issue. And because they didn't take any soundings from anybody that could point out that there might be flaws or challenges with this approach, that they just thought, oh, this is great. This is something free. We can just do this. There's no downside to it. And in her case, so this is going to make me look great with, the LGBTQ plus community. And I think with some of them, it has made her look great. But the problem is it's had a huge downside, and it's upset, a lot of women who didn't want to have their rights taken away from them.
Yeah, definitely. Can you tell us when and why you first got involved in the issues around prostitution?
Yeah, so I think that's about 12 years ago when I went to help Rhoda Grant. So it's quite a long time ago now. And that was before I was elected.
Yeah. And what was it why did you want to get involved with her on that?
I'd heard that she was doing the bill, and I just had an immediate sort of visceral response to it in my body. And I thought, I've got to get involved and help with this. So it's been something that I've been really passionate about for really quite a long time.
Okay. Somebody in the chat has said that whenever they bring up the issue of prostitution, people dismiss it by saying that it's the oldest profession and it's an inevitable part of society. Do you encounter similar opposition, and what do you say in response?
Yeah, I mean, people will say things like that. I mean, quite clearly it's not the oldest profession because, we need to eat. So I guess that would probably be farming. But we always just say, well, no, it's the oldest form of exploitation, which it is. And yes, there are lots of people that want to argue to be able to exploit others freely. But I guess we have to think about what kind of society do we want to live in? Do we value women? Do we value girls? Do we want to see them being exploited in flats, across the whole of the country? Or do we actually think this is unacceptable? And, I do accept that, you're probably not going to be able to completely outlaw prostitution with this piece of legislation. That I accept. And I think anybody sensible would say the same thing to you. But I also don't accept that prostitution is inevitable. I think you could create a society where, it was not acceptable to participate in prostitution. And certainly if you look at countries that have had this legislation in place for a long time, and Sweden is the obvious example because they were the country that did it first. So they did it about 25 years ago. It's now culturally, and this is very different from neighbouring countries, because if you think about Germany, it's not that far away. In Sweden, it is culturally unacceptable to talk about buying sex. So a Swedish man explained this to me, and he said, if you're out and you're with your guy friends, whatever, and a guy friend said to you, oh, I'm going to go and buy, pay for a blowjob or whatever, everybody would be like, oh my God, that's totally unacceptable. Whereas in Germany, the advertising for sexual acts purchase is everywhere. I don't know if this was AI, but I did see something on social media. It was schoolgirls in school uniforms getting off a bus, and a menu for a brothel was on the side of that bus. And it was that juxtaposition between, young girls and then seeing this on the side. We don't want to go there. And presumably, surely that's the point of having a legislature. Surely that's the point of politicians, is that people put us there to imagine a better society, a better world for all of us. That's what we are there to do, right? And if you come into politics and you don't achieve anything that's going to make things better, I do wonder sometimes why we're all here if that's not what we're doing.
Brilliant. The next question is, what do you think about universities and allegedly job centres suggesting things like OnlyFans and porn as work?
So that did happen in Germany. So the reason that that's circulating is that actually happened in Germany. But it didn't happen for very long. because they were sued. So a group then decided that they would sue the government for making that happen, and the government backed down on it. So it has happened. But I guess this is the logical conclusion. If you think that sex is work, then that is the logical conclusion of this argument, that you would be sitting down. And France obviously have implemented the equality model as well, and more recently in Sweden. And I saw a very good advert that the French had used at the time when this bill was going through their parliament, and it was careers advice. So they had two parents and a 15, 16-year-old girl go into school to sit and have careers advice, and the careers advice was, have you thought about prostitution? You know, and it was very funny. They'd done it. It was very cleverly done. It was very funny. And it was hard-hitting and funny. But it's things like that. So this is what you'd have to do. You want to live in a world where, you know, if you are a bit down on your luck and you've lost your job and you haven't got any money and you can be sent to work in a brothel. Is that what we want? So I don't think that is what we want. So, and I believe that we are currently living in a pimp state, because any state that profits in any way from exploitation, you know, of commercial sex, and I believe that Scotland does, and therefore I think we're living in a pimp state. That should not be the case. So that's why I'm suggesting this legislation, because I don't think Scots want that. I think Scotland, we think of ourselves as better than that. And I think we want better than that for women and girls. And I do say women and girls, and sometimes I get picked up on it, and people say to me, well, there's men and boys that are exploiting prostitution. There are, but the numbers are very small in comparison. So we think that it's about 96% of people exploiting prostitution are women. So that's why I use the shorthand. I talk about those exploited in prostitution as being women, because for the most part, it is women and girls.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is, the Scottish Government seems determined to avoid implementing the Supreme Court ruling. Will the EHRC guidance make a difference? And if not, what will make them comply?
Yes, I would agree with you. I think they are having to be dragged kicking and screaming to change anything. And anybody that's been watching this will know that, you know, me and a number of other women in this parliament have been doggedly pursuing them on this issue for months and months and months without much success. I will say it's as if they're, you know, operating in a parallel universe, where if they just keep repeating a kind of a mantra that says that they accept it, but then they don't actually take any action to do with that acceptance, that somehow we'll all just get bored and go to something else, which I'm not sure why they would be thinking that. So yeah, they've been very slow. And then I could immediately see that they were latching on to this idea that they had to wait for the guidance from the regulator. And I then had a meeting with the regulator where the regulator said, oh no, they absolutely must not wait for the guidance, because the law is the law and the law has changed. And therefore, you know, we produce guidance, but that's just to be helpful, you know, to give certain scenarios, to be helpful, to show how that this might work in practice. But they were very explicit, and they said that publicly and privately, that the Scottish Government must not wait for the regulator. And yet they kept standing up in Parliament. And that's why, I mean, there's videos of me banging my head on my desk, because it's so frustrating, where they're literally saying the opposite of what the regulator is telling them to do with a completely straight face. You know, oh no, we must wait for it. And it's like, no, you're not supposed to be waiting for that. So what we have seen is they're complying with losing certain court cases. So obviously four of them in Scotland have just had a win against them recently, and forcing them to comply over school toilets, although there was another court case in the Borders on that, which said the same thing, that it must have single-sex toilets. So it's very slow, and I have to say it's much, much slower than I thought it would be. I thought, naively, I must learn not to be so naive about these things, that, you know, once the Supreme Court clarity came in, that the government would fall into line. But I'm sort of realising it's probably not so simple as that, because if you think about it, they've led an awful lot of people and organisations up a hill and basically said, so we're going to get you this, and it's going to do this, it's going to do that. And then to sort of turn around very abruptly and make a U-turn and apologise, which is what I would like and wanted them to do. I don't think they feel they can do it. I think this is their way of saving face, and that they're just going to back away from it very slowly and just pretend that nothing happened and hope that people forget about it. So yeah, which is, I find it very frustrating. I can sort of see why you might do that if you're in government, but I think it's cowardly.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I'm going to hand back to Mary now for the final few minutes. Thank you, Ash.
Thank you, Vicky. What's interesting questions. I was at a meeting with Scottish Government civil servants where they very openly acknowledged that they didn't expect to lose. And I wonder, I know
Yeah.
I can eye roll with you, but I wonder if part of that reluctance is that they've been caught sleeping at the wheel and that they really are having to, you know, kind of chivvy along all sorts of different organizations that they, you know, departments within the government that they actually need to get to think about this.
Yeah.
I mean, I was at I know we're here to talk about you, but the Health Improvement Scotland meeting, and they hadn't heard of the Supreme Court ruling. And I, you
They've
know,
been under a rock.
I know, and I suppose if you think about it, if they're prepared to actually say that publicly in a meeting, whether it's true or not, it's not a good place to be.
It's the climate we're in. And I just think I was away talking to some other parliamentarians last week in a completely different jurisdiction. And when I tried to explain to them what had been going on in Scotland, I looked around at one point and everyone was just looking at me like this, as if they couldn't quite get their head around how bizarre and ridiculous this situation was. And I looked at them and I felt like, yeah, I agree with the way you're looking at me right now, because it is madness. But it's this kind of, it's a collective madness, isn't it? That so many people are subscribed to. And it's so embedded now, I think, in the public sector. I was sort of describing it a while ago as like it's the tentacles of it are embedded everywhere. And pulling them all out one by one is just going to take us a really long time. And it's very frustrating, but that unfortunately that's where we are.
Indeed, it is where we are, and I suppose, you know, the expectation that women are going to have to, you know, continue to, you know, fight legal cases is just astonishing, really. But I'm sure we could do a whole other podcast in relation to that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you one, and this is curiosity on my part, not that I'm thinking about becoming a political candidate or anything like that, but I was struck by the fact that you've been in a major party, you've been in government, you've been a minister, you've been in a new party where things are coming together, and you're now an independent. And it's like that's a vast experience of different aspects of government, really.
Yeah.
And so what's your biggest take from all of that? What's been good about it? What's not been so good? And then my final question would be, what would you give advice to people who do want to stand in politics?
I think that's nearly 10 years I've been elected now, and I think my general reflections are that the party political system, I mean, I understand why we have it and everything, but I genuinely don't think it's working that well for the public. And as I said, being in different jurisdictions last week, where there are other jurisdictions where, like Jersey or something like that, where they don't have, it's just all independence. You know, I know it's very small. It's obviously it's a different context, but it's not impossible to have a system where the public are a bit more engaged and they pick their politicians based on, you know, issues that are important to them and whether somebody's got a track record or expertise in that area, rather than just voting, you know, blue, yellow, red, and then just like just take what you get sort of thing. And it's quite difficult to operate in a political party if you're somebody that has quite strong beliefs about things, because just as an example, I've seen it so many times in here that members of the government political party will be on a committee, an issue will come in front of the committee, whether it's legislation or something else. They'll be briefed that the government's current position is X. They'll then fight doggedly on the committee about X. Then the opposition will get involved. The government will have a few bad front pages. And then over the weeks that it's coming, they'll then reverse their position, therefore completely hanging out to dry the members that have then so loyally supported them, who now have to go in and pretend that they hadn't made that argument. So it's being in a political party can be quite a difficult and at times very compromising position to be in, because although you're exercising loyalty, which in theory is a good characteristic, that in other times it can be very personally compromising. So I guess different people deal with that in different ways, and that was one of the things that I found most difficult about being a political party, is that you are there to really just to vote for whatever the leadership wants to do this week, and it could be different next week. That's quite challenging, but that's the system we have. So if people want to get into politics, it's very difficult to do it as an independent. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. So for the most part, you have to pick a party that sort of aligns as much with your views as possible. And I think for most people that's quite difficult, because most people don't fit into that's a box of a single political party. So yeah, it is quite challenging, and I wonder whether the Parliament would be better with a number of really strong independent voices in it. So there are a few people that are saying they're going to run as independents, like Fergus Ewing, who's obviously a very strong parliamentarian in a number of areas, and a few others. And we've had some in the past, like Margaret MacDonald. So, but I think it really depends on the public and what, and who they want to put in and what sort of parliament they want to see. But I think the next parliament could look very different to the one that we have at the moment.
Yes, I agree. I think it will look quite different, even just because there are different people going to be standing in the parties.
Yep.
And certainly, we're quite keen to, with candidates who are standing, to be getting a commitment from them about violence against women and girls and how to reduce that. So, what I'd like to do is thank you very much. That was really fascinating. The hour has passed by really quickly, and I'm sure we could have chatted on for much longer, but I know you're at work and you've got a vote to go and see to,
Yes.
and a question to ask as well. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time. That's been really interesting and fascinating, and wish you all the best with taking the bill forward. And if there's anything that you think that we can do to help, then I'm sure we'll be in touch. So
Yes,
thank you very much.
I'm obviously asking everybody that wants to get involved to write to their politicians about the bill and ask them to have a meeting about it or to support it. So that would be really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, personally, I have written to all of my MSPs, and I've only had acknowledgement from one who said, and it's a male, who said that he was going to look at the bill very carefully.
Which means
So,
I'll translate that. That means I'll wait for the voting sheet from the whips.
exactly. Anyway, thank you so much, Ash. That's been really good.
Thank you.
So thanks very much.
Bye.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and tap the bell to make sure you don't miss new content. Sign up to our newsletter at www.womensrights.network, and if you're interested in becoming a member, click on the Join Us link.